Advanced Studio Classroom is on the air. Join us today as we talk about the problem of loneliness. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another Advanced Studio Classroom. I'm your host for today. My name is Simon, and you are joining me for the second day of our July opinion article. The article is called Facing the Tough Issues of Life, and it covers 3 different days. Each day has a different topic with a different mini lesson. Today's lesson is called Loneliness, the New Heart Disease, and that title really gives you a good idea of what we're going to be talking about, the problem of loneliness. Now, yesterday for our program, I was joined by 2 very special panelists, both of whom had excellent opinions to offer on the subject of child rearing. Let's hope they also have excellent opinions to offer on this subject of loneliness. Gabriel Harbour, Super Sentence Man, welcome back to Advance.
Thank you, Simon. Yes, I do have some opinions to offer about the idea of loneliness. I think it's a very important topic to talk about these days. It's perhaps an underrated problem or underestimated problem.
And Gabe, I was going to say, I don't want to beat this dead horse too much, but it must be lonely being the only superhero here at Studio Classroom.
All right, Simon. You're right. Maybe I should make you guys superheroes.
I would like to be, super punctuation.
You know what?
Man
I need a
like
villain.
That.
Simon, I need a villain on the show. Like a bad guy to balance.
That sounds like a bad deal.
I don't want to be the villain. That's no good. Anyway, Gabe, it's great to have you. I know you spend most of your time with Let's Talk in English, but you are...
Or Studio Classroom.
Oh, with Studio Classroom. But you are an interesting guy, and so we're glad to have you here at Advanced. One of my dear friends. The other panelist today is another one of my dear friends, Zach Mills from Studio Classroom. Welcome, Zach.
Thank you so much. Now, I'm not a big fan of your opening or your introductions. Simon, you shouldn't introduce people with superlatives. You got to there's nowhere to go.
Well, I didn't say you were the most opinionated. I just said you were opinionated guys.
And all right, fair enough.
I think that's important because otherwise we won't have a very good discussion, right?
That's true.
You need a variety of opinions and different ways of thinking to make conversations really interesting.
Well, I'm glad that you reminded our readers and us that it is an opinion article, but like you said, the title of this particular article is Loneliness, the New Heart Disease, which kind of tips towards there's also some we're looking at the category of health.
Mm-hmm. It's, the interesting thing about this article, you're right, we are talking about loneliness and health and kind of giving it a bad name here, the term loneliness. But there are actually other words that are related to this idea of loneliness that we're actually going to introduce through this article. One of them is solitude, the idea of solitude. But we also hear a term, sometimes we hear about people who are introverted as opposed to extroverted. Gabe, do you want to just quickly tell us the difference between an extrovert and an introvert?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, an extrovert is someone who takes most of their energy from being around people and, they love talking to other people. You might say they're a social butterfly. In some cases, an introvert gets a lot of their energy just from being alone.
So in the same way that they kind of gave a new meaning to the term parenting and the term child rearing yesterday, for those of you who weren't listening to yesterday's program, they sort of used this word parenting, which doesn't really have any negative meaning, but they used it to describe negative parenting habits. And they used the term child rearing to describe positive parenting habits, right?
So in the same way today, we want to keep that in mind, that there is this contrast or this difference between, loneliness, whether we're talking about personality, like being introverted, or even just the act of seeking out solitude.
Yeah, so you could say a difference between loneliness and being alone, right? There's a very clear difference there. Well, let's get into our first reading for today. Listeners, you can find this lesson on page 27 of your July Advanced magazine. We're going to read the first introductory section in our first reading now.
Loneliness, the new heart disease. You know what's been proven to contribute substantially to the overall death rate? Loneliness. The figure most often reported is that chronic loneliness has the same effect as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So why, in response, aren't more of us running out to hug our neighbors? Some of you will explain, quietly and calmly, that you're introverts who value time alone and that this doesn't apply to you. You're entirely correct. Unlike chronic loneliness, a consciously chosen solitary life can be both satisfying and healthy.
So this reading actually started with a very bold statement. They say, you know what's been proven to contribute substantially to the overall death rate in 2019? Loneliness. Mm-hmm. And basically what that means is that loneliness is something that's much more serious than we usually think, right?
It's true. I read an article recently called "Loneliness is the New Smoking." I mean, everybody knows that smoking kills. It's a big cause of death everywhere. And loneliness to be the new smoking, I didn't think about that before.
But I guess the really big thing is we don't usually think of loneliness as having physical health effects.
Yeah.
We know it's not a feeling that people like to have, and it can be hard on people mentally. My father was a pastor when I was growing up, and we spent a fair bit of time visiting what are called shut-ins. Shut-ins are basically older people who can't get out of their home easily. And some of those people were, really lonely and like a very difficult place in life. Family had moved away. They didn't have too many people around, and you could see the negative effect on lonely people.
And sometimes people prefer or choose that kind of lifestyle, but Simon, the term that Simon used, shut-in, it doesn't give that impression. They don't necessarily choose to be lonely. I think someone who chooses to be lonely or alone would be called hermit. But that's just a side note. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a person who likes to be alone.
Yeah.
But loneliness, again, it's this sort of feeling of not having anyone around. And you could see the negative effects of that, like I say.
That's interesting, Simon, that you said you could see it, right? When you walk into the room, it's almost apparent just from their physical appearance. In one article, they were mentioning some health, listing out some of the health risks of loneliness or being alone. And you mentioned, it could be that of compared to the new smoking.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
They mentioned it is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day is one statistic. Another one is that loneliness is actually worse for you physically than obesity.
Well, see, yeah, and that's the thing. When I say you could see the effects of it, I didn't mean you could see the health effects. Like, there's sort of a thing where, honestly, if either of you came over to my house this Saturday, you'd be lucky to get a glass of water because I wouldn't put too much preparation into your visit to my house, right? But older people who don't have people who visit them and are kind of shut in, having visitors is kind of a really big deal. And your sense as a visitor is like, I am not this important, right? And so you sort of feel bad about that kind of role that you're playing, like this idea that your visit is of fairly big significance to people, because maybe the visit isn't of such big significance to you. So I meant mostly you could see kind of the mental effect. But this idea that it also has physical effects was kind of surprising to me. And so they end the first paragraph with this question, why aren't more of us running out to hug our neighbors to make friends? And I think that's a good question, right?
Well, I think partly it's a cultural thing too, though. I mean, really, not every culture is big on hugging or kissing like the French are.
Yeah. Well, and we actually get into the other reason why people might not do this and why some people might not want you to run over and hug them as introversion, right? That word you used, Gabe.
Well, earlier, Gabe had defined introvert, and I could almost imagine all the introverts maybe listening, shuddering at the idea of someone running over to them and giving them a hug. No, thank you, right?
So that's what they say. Some of you will explain quietly and calmly because introverts tend to be quiet and calm, right? That you're introverts who value time alone and that this loneliness thing doesn't apply to you. You're entirely correct. Unlike chronic loneliness, a consciously chosen solitary life can be satisfying and healthy. So we're basically talking here about people who want to be around other people but can't for whatever reason. There are negative mental effects for those people, but there are also negative physical effects. But some people choose to spend time alone, and they don't suffer these negative effects in the same way.
Right. And I think that's really the contrast there, is that on one hand they can't, they don't have the ability to even make that choice, whereas those who are choosing be alone or to live solitarily, to use a phrase that we learned yesterday, the difference is night and day.
Yeah, sure.
So that basically raises this question that we get into in the next reading. What's the difference between someone who's an introvert and someone who is legitimately lonely in a negative sort of way? Let's get into that now in our second reading. And listeners, again, you can find that on page 27 of your magazine.
What's the difference? Philosopher Paul Tillich made what I believe is the most concise distinction between loneliness and solitude when he wrote, "Our language has wisely sensed these two sides of man's being alone. It has created the word loneliness to express the pain of being alone, and it has created the word solitude to express the glory of being alone. Although in daily life we do not always distinguish these words, we should do so consistently and thus deepen our understanding of our human predicament. Unwilling loneliness, in contrast to solitude, is disorienting. Loneliness is where we cannot be who we really are."
Okay, so at the beginning of this reading, we're introduced to a philosopher. Tell us a little bit about this guy, Zach.
Okay, so we're introduced to Paul Tillich, and as far as I know, here it says he's a philosopher. I think he dabbled in theology and was a professor at some point.
Okay, and so he's obviously done some writing about this topic of loneliness and solitude, because we are given a quote of something he's written. He says, "Our language has wisely sensed these two sides of man's being alone." And here, of course, when they say man, they mean humanity, all people. "It has created the word loneliness to express the pain of being alone, and it has created the word solitude to express the glory of being alone." So I think we all know what it is to feel lonely. What are they exactly talking about when they say the glory of solitude, Gabe?
It's great. I'm an extrovert, but every once in a while I like getting off by myself sometime.
One time when you really liked it. Yeah.
No, it's true. I enjoy solitude every once in a while, but it's a great feeling. I also have a lot of thoughts, believe it or not, that I don't just like to express to other people. Sure. And so I like to dwell on those thoughts to try to work them out myself, maybe write in a journal of some kind. And so that's part of the glory of solitude.
So when we use this word solitude, we understand that it's kind of the same thing as loneliness. You might use the phrase the other side of the same coin.
Sure. Sometimes
we talk about that sort of thing in English, where these things are really kind of the same thing, but it's a different way of looking at it or a different way of experiencing it. How does one experience solitude? Do you have to go off and be by yourself in a cabin?
That's one way. Gabe mentioned another. He mentioned the activity of journaling. And I think that's it. Basically, what comes to my mind is just the idea of taking some time to reflect, process. I remember one guy had mentioned, when he likes to go and be alone, he likes to kind of review the day and renew his thoughts, right? Review and renew.
So time for yourself. That's
Sure.
the idea. Okay. They say here in this quote, it continues on to say, although in daily life we do not always distinguish these words, meaning we kind of think of them as being the same thing. We don't always recognize the negative as opposed to the positive aspects of the two words. We should do so consistently, so we should distinguish between them, keep them clear in our minds what the difference is consistently. And why should we do that, Gabe?
Well, we read here, to thus deepen our understanding of our human predicament. And I agree. I think it's important to keep these words separate. I personally haven't confused them before. I've usually thought of loneliness as a negative thing and solitude as kind of a good thing. to do every once in a while. But he talks about this being as part of our human predicament, maybe this lack of understanding.
Mm-hmm. What do we mean by the human predicament, Zach?
Okay, so this is kind of a bigger term, so therefore appropriate to be discussed by someone like a philosopher. But when I think of human predicament, and, Simon, you and I, our answers may be similar only because, often we go on walks together and you download lots of thoughts and I've picked up on a few.
That's Zach's way of saying I am opinionated, listeners.
Or maybe extroverted, I don't know. But in any case, no, I think so the word predicament is just an unfortunate situation to kind of be in, an unpleasant situation or reality that we all have to face. So human being, this is almost universal, something that we all face. And so for me, I think a lot of that is facing suffering or even the evil that exists in the world.
See, I don't actually think of predicament as being necessarily negative. I think of it as just basically meaning situation, our human situation. And I would say there are negative parts of that, right? Like we all suffer, we all have problems, we all feel lonely, but there's also positive things that are part of that.
Now you see why I go on these walks.
There
Very insightful from someone.
Downloading a new idea. Okay, so they go on to say unwilling loneliness in contrast to solitude. The idea being there that you are lonely because you don't have anyone to be with, not because you want to be alone. And then in contrast to solitude, where you've decided you need some time by yourself, so you're choosing to get away from other people.
And when you make that choice and you go and be alone or to journal or to reflect, you're kind of orienting yourself to the world. You're trying to get your bearings, so to speak.
Okay, but they say here unwilling loneliness is disorienting.
It's on the other side of the coin, Zach. If you don't want to be alone, actually, if you're alone all the time and you really do want to have that outlet to be with other people and to talk, then if you don't have that, if that's not given to you, if it's not there for you, that can also be disorienting because those kinds of conversations can also be orienting. They can also help you get your bearings on the world. I go on those walks with you guys sometimes, every once in a while, and it's great to have a sounding board. I think there's, both journals and people, live interactions are very useful and very necessary at different points of life. And one might be just your private thoughts, and one we might call it a sounding board, where we also can learn more about ourselves and the world.
It's very interesting that we're talking about this loneliness as though it is a big problem, especially in the time of social media, because one of the big promises that social media kind of offered was that it was going to connect us to everyone we knew all the time. But we know from experience that often what people post on their social media account is what they want us to see of their life. Not
almost the avatar self.
Yeah, like their PR image as opposed to what's really going on,
it's
right?
Like some positive experiences or maybe a joke to crack everybody up. And it's just, usually putting themselves in a really positive light, or at least a light where everybody's going to like them and leave some comments.
The life that you want people to think you have, as opposed to the life you have, right?
So if they only know your persona, do they really know you?
Yeah.
Well, and so this is the last sentence of this reading is really interesting then, because we think of this as being an age that we are living in where really there shouldn't be any loneliness because we're all connected all the time. But they say here, loneliness is where we cannot be who we really are. And so you can sort of see that if people are feeling pressure to engage with social media, but not really be themselves, not really engage with people fully as individuals, then loneliness is the result. And I think that's a very insightful sort of comment, that last sentence. Loneliness is where we cannot be who we really are. That obviously points out that we have this need. We have a need to be with other people. And the question is, how do we meet this need, the needs that humans have to be part of a bigger community? And we get into that in our third reading. Listeners, we're going to look at the right-hand column now of our article as we do our third reading together.
Meeting our deepest needs. One of the oldest findings on loneliness involved children who were kept in an orphanage without any adult touch or attention apart from being fed and kept clean. Their caretakers thought they were keeping the children from catching deadly infectious diseases, but were surprised when the children died anyway. They lost the infants not to a familiar infection, but from what became known as a failure to thrive. And I believe what's now being called an epidemic of loneliness is an adult version of the failure to thrive. Chronically lonely people at any age suffer from acute physical, psychological, intellectual, and emotional deprivations. Human beings need touch and closeness as much as we need sleep. So let's celebrate independence while understanding it doesn't mean alienation. Our survival depends on offering and accepting tenderness, which is the world's best offer to pass along a light.
Okay, and so in the first paragraph of this reading, we're introduced to this phrase that might be familiar to you if you are a parent or if you're involved in education. It's the term failure to thrive. And this term is the result of some research that was done quite a number of years ago, and that's the research that's described in this paragraph. Tell us a little bit about the research. What did they look at, Gabe?
All right. Well, they were taking a look at the lives of children, actually, who were kept in an orphanage without any adult touch or attention apart from being fed and kept clean. This is a sad picture in my mind, anyway. I know a lot of people have a negative impression of, I don't know, there's a lot of movies about orphanages and how they don't take care of the kids. And I don't think that's true in most orphanages. I think they do try to take care of them. But this kind of study, if you're just feeding the kids and cleaning them and not doing anything else, I would imagine it would have a detrimental effect.
Well, I think the situation specifically here that they were looking at was in state-run institutions where they were basically overwhelmed by the number of orphans during a really bad economic time. Mm-hmm. And so the result was that they managed to meet the physical needs of the kids. So mm-hmm. they met what we had thought of as being the requirements for kids growing up at that time, but there just wasn't the ability, the resources, the capacity to take care of much more than that. And so they actually say here that they didn't receive adult touch or attention apart from being fed and kept clean. So the idea here being that what is missing is sort of love, human connection.
So there's a bit of irony kind of in this first paragraph, which is they thought they were trying to keep them from basically from dying, mm-hmm. From infectious diseases, so physically keeping them out of harm's way. But the irony being that actually they died, their hearts had needs as well, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah. So, and they described this as failure to thrive. So basically, some of these children were becoming ill and dying, basically not because of medical issues or what we would think of traditionally as medical issues. They weren't getting diseases. They weren't starving, but they were failing to thrive. And they introduce us as we continue on with this reading to what is now emerging as an adult version of this failure to thrive. The lesson just being that children, like other adults, need more than just their physical needs met. We're social creatures. We need to be part of a group and be surrounded by people who love us and care about us and interact with us and those things. And
so, for sure. And our lesson calls it an epidemic of loneliness.
That's right. And it's an interesting word because, of course, an epidemic, well, what is an epidemic?
Well, it's a terrible disease that goes around, right? And we have a sidebar here that even talks about this word epidemic, right? It's not a word used lightly by those working in medicine. So the fact that people are describing loneliness as an epidemic means it's a pretty serious, almost like a disease.
Very large scale.
Mm-hmm. So basically an epidemic is a disease that is spreading kind of out of control within an area. And so here they have this epidemic of loneliness. They describe it as being an adult version of failure to thrive. And they say chronically lonely people at any age suffer from acute physical, psychological, intellectual, and emotional deprivations. What are deprivations, Zach?
Well, so earlier you said it really well that we are social creatures and we have these needs. And if those needs, like the psychological need, the intellectual, the emotional, if those needs aren't being met, then they're being deprived, or you suffer deprivations, mm-hmm. right?
Like a lack of something.
Exactly.
Right? Not enough of something. Okay, so they say here that basically, in summary, human beings need touch and closeness as much as they need sleep. And so they conclude with an interesting paragraph. They say, so let's celebrate independence because it is good sometimes to be in solitude, right? To be alone. You can get a lot out of that. But while understanding it doesn't mean alienation. So when someone is alienated, what happens to them?
Well, usually
They're like an alien.
Kind of. No. I've only ever heard this term used kind of in a negative sense. But yeah, alienation is just the idea of being away from the crowd, being away from other people in a negative way.
Being like the stranger, the strange one.
Pushed
who's
outside.
Not in the group, right?
Yeah.
So
Not accepted, yeah.
So we need to understand that independence can be a good thing, but it doesn't mean alienation is a good thing. We want people to be able to be part of the group. Our survival depends on offering and accepting tenderness, which is the world's best offer to pass along a light. Nice ending sentence. So today, listeners, as you go out, be aware of people around you who might be suffering from loneliness and ask yourself what nice, kind thing you might be able to do to make someone's life just a little bit better and a little bit more bearable. Join us again tomorrow as we continue on with this topic of facing the tough issues of life. Until then, I'm Simon.
I'm Zach.
And I'm Gabe.
Saying bye for now.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.